Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku became a gladiator in ancient Rome's arenas. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The air in the disaster response compound, or the DRC, tasted of pulverized concrete and artificial rain. It was a familiar, almost comforting flavor to Izuku Midoriya. It was the taste of training, of progress. High above, sprinklers built into the geodesic dome ceiling simulated a miserable gray drizzle, soaking the fabricated ruins of the collapsed urban zone. Mangled steel rebar jutted from shattered ferroconcrete pillars like broken bones, and overturned cars, their paint scoured by manufactured wear, served as both obstacles and cover. Oyama is pinned down in the west sector. The building is unstable, repeat, unstable. Momo Yaoyorozu's voice, crisp and commanding despite the static, crackled in his earpiece. Todoroki-san is creating an ice brace, but we need evac support now. On it! Izuku replied, his voice a puff of steam in the cool air. He vaulted over a collapsed wall, the reinforced soles of his iron sole boots grating against the debris. One for all hummed beneath his skin, a controlled river of power thrumming at 5%. He had long since mastered this level, able to move with a fluid, contained strength that felt less like a borrowed cataclysm and more like an extension of his own body. His mind was a whirring engine of calculations. West Sector. Aoyama's position is near the Mox subway entrance. Todoroki's ice will hold, but the ambient temperature drop will make the metal supports more brittle. If the villain proxies apply explosive force, this was their most complex simulation yet. A coordinated villain attack on a city's infrastructure during a natural disaster, in this case, a tremor-induced collapse. Mr. Aizawa watched from the central observation deck, his gaze a tangible weight, ensuring they treated every plastic and plaster threat as if it were real. Bakugo, Kirishima, you're closest to the primary objective, the bomb in the underground generator room. Ida's voice boomed, cutting through the comms with the authority of their class president. Report your status. A burst of static, followed by a guttural roar. Shut up, Four Eyes! We know the damn mission! An explosion punctuated Bakugo's reply, the sound echoing dully through the cavernous space. A moment later, Kirishima's more cheerful voice followed. We're good, Ida! Almost there! It's super manly down here! Izuku allowed himself a small, focused smile. They were working like a well-oiled machine. His team, consisting of himself, Ochiko Uraraka, and Tsuyu Azui, was tasked with search and rescue, zipping through the treacherous terrain to extract civilian dummies and provide support where needed. Deku-kun, I have a visual on 2 dummies trapped in that overturned bus. Uraraka's voice called out. He glanced to his right, and saw her waving from the roof of a 3-story building shell. She was a point of vibrant color against the gray backdrop, her determination a palpable force even from a distance. Got it! I'll stabilize, you lift! He yelled back, already changing course. He used Black Whip, the tendrils of dark energy lashing out from his arms with practiced ease. They were no longer the wild, uncontrollable limbs of his first manifestation. Now they were precise, wrapping around a thick concrete beam above the teetering bus. He anchored himself, pulling the tendrils taut to create a stable line for Uraraka to descend. It was a dance they'd practiced 100 times. He was the anchor, she was the delicate, zero-gravity touch. As she floated down, Tsuyu landed beside him with a soft thump, her long tongue retracting after snagging a loose piece of rebar to secure a nearby wall. The rain is making the surfaces slick, Karo. We need to be careful. Right. Izuku nodded, his eyes scanning every shadow, every crumbling facade. His mind was always cataloging, analyzing. Danger sense isn't tingling, but that doesn't mean we can relax. The simulation parameter said to expect an unforeseen variable in the final phase. And then it happened. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't a villain's cackle or a swarm of robots. It was a sound, or rather, the absence of it. The drone of the sprinklers, the hum of the facility's ventilation, the distant crackle of Bakugo's explosions, it all warped, stretched like melting taffy, and then snapped into a dead, ringing silence. A pressure change popped Izuku's ears. The air grew thick, heavy with ozone, and a pale, sickly violet light began to bleed into the world from a point in the center of the zone. What was that? Uraraka asked, her voice tight with confusion as she landed beside him. Izuku's danger sense, dormant moments before, erupted into a piercing shriek in his mind, a psychic siren so loud it made his teeth ache. This was not part of the test. This was real. Everyone, fall back to the entrance. Code Red! Ida's voice, stripped of its usual procedural calm, screamed through the comms. A villain has breached the DRC. This is not a drill. From the epicenter of the violet light, a figure stepped forth. He was tall and unnervingly gaunt, clad in a patchwork of historical armor, a Roman legionary's helmet here, a samurai's pauldron there, a medieval knight's greave on one leg. His face was hidden behind a smooth, porcelain mask featureless save for two weeping black eye slits. Behold, the weakness of the modern age! The man's voice echoed, distorted and amplified by some unseen technology. It was the voice of a zealot, dripping with condescending pity. An era of pathetic heroes propping up a fragile, decadent society. You have forgotten the glorious crucible of the past, the purity of strength forged in blood and iron. I am Epic, and I am here to remind you. As he spoke, the world around him began to fracture. Reality itself seemed to tear like wet paper. Shimmering, heat haze-like rifts, no bigger than a dinner plate, began to open and close randomly in the air. One opened beside a concrete pillar, and for a split second, Izuku saw not the DRC, but a dense, primordial jungle teeming with ferns the size of trees. Another flickered open on the ground, revealing a churning, black, star-filled void. His quirk is chronoclasm, Yayarosa's panicked voice supplied, no doubt relaying information from the teachers. He creates unstable fissures in space-time. Do not touch them! Todoroki was the first to act. A massive glacier erupted from the ground, surging towards Epic. But the villain simply raised a hand, and a dozen rifts opened in the path of the ice. The glacier shattered into pieces, each disappearing into a different portal, vanishing from existence. Your power is meaningless, Epic droned. A parlor trick against the awesome, unforgiving machinery of history. The rifts began to grow larger, more aggressive. One tore open the ground beneath Kirishima and Bakugo, who were just emerging from the sublevels. Kirishima hardened his body, taking the brunt of the spatial distortion as Bakugo used a controlled explosion to propel them both to safety. The battlefield devolved into chaos. Class 1A, trained for villains who fought on a single, stable plane of existence, were now battling the very fabric of their reality. They were separated, their formations broken, their attacks swallowed by shimmering pockets of nothingness. Izuku pushed himself to his limit. He used Black Whip to pull Zero away from a rift that crackled with the sound of cannon fire and the smell of salt water. He used One for All to dash across the field, grabbing Mineta by the collar and flinging him towards Azuri just as a portal showing a windswept desert opened where he'd been standing. He was a green blur of motion, his mind racing faster than ever. The rifts are random, but he seems to control their general location. He's hurting us, trying to disorient and separate. We need to take him down directly. Ida! Uraraka! We need to get to the villain! Izuku yelled, dodging a rift that showed a brief, terrifying glimpse of a world made entirely of screaming faces. Right behind you! Ida's engines roared to life. They converged, a three-person strike team. Ida would be the spearhead, Uraraka would disrupt the villain's footing with her quirk, and Izuku would deliver the decisive blow. It was a solid plan, a classic pincer movement. But Epic was not a classic villain. As Ida charged, his recipro burst leaving trails in the damp air. Epic didn't even look at him. He simply gestured, and a massive, vertical rift, 10 feet high, tore open directly in Ida's path. Through it, Izuku saw a horrifying sight, the deck of a wooden ship tossed on a stormy sea, where men with long beards and horned helmets were locked in a bloody axe battle. Ida couldn't stop. He was moving too fast. Ida! Uraraka screamed. Izuku's heart hammered against his ribs. No! Without a second thought, he fired a Black Whip tendril. It wasn't aimed at Ida. It was aimed at the chunk of rubble Ida had just passed. The tendril latched on, and with a full-bodied roar, Izuku put every ounce of his 5% strength into the pull. He became an anchor, the whip a safety line. Ida's trajectory was violently arrested, his armored form swinging in a wide, uncontrolled arc away from the portal. Just as it snapped shut with a sound like shattering glass, he crashed into a wall, dented but safe. The maneuver, however, had left Izuku and Uraraka exposed. Epic turned his masked face towards them, and the air around them began to shimmer violently. "A noble sacrifice," the villain said, a hint of something that might have been admiration in his distorted voice. "The instinct to protect one's tribe. A truly classical virtue. Perhaps you have potential." A new rift began to form, not in front of them, but directly between them. It started as a pinprick of violet light and expanded with terrifying speed. It didn't show a glimpse of another time or place. It was a swirling, incandescent vortex, pulling at them with a tangible, physical force. Loose pebbles and dust were sucked into its maw. Uraraka's hair whipped around her face as she struggled to keep her footing. "It's pulling me in!" she cried out, her boots sliding on the wet ground. Izuku planted his feet, the green lightning of one for all flaring around him. His mind went into that strange, hyper-focused state where the world slowed to a crawl. He saw the terror in Uraraka's eyes. He saw the way the portal's gravity was focused entirely on her. He saw the triumphant, expectant posture of Epic. He saw the apathetic, weeping eyes of the porcelain mask. And in that frozen moment, he saw All Might's smiling face, his words echoing from a memory that felt a lifetime away. "The truly heroic thing is not to win, but to save." There was no time for a plan. No room for analysis. There was only instinct. A pure, undiluted, heroic impulse that had been the core of his being long before he'd ever inherited a quirk. He moved. He lunged forward, not towards the villain, but towards his friend. He slammed into her with his shoulder, a solid, desperate shove. "Gio!" he screamed, the single word torn from his lungs. The force of his push sent her stumbling backward, out of the portal's immediate gravitational pull. She fell to the ground, safe, her wide, horrified eyes locking onto his. But his momentum had carried him forward, directly into the space she had just occupied. The pull was immense, 1,000 hooks sinking into his flesh. The world dissolved into a smear of violet and black. He felt a tearing sensation, as if his very atoms were being unraveled and restitched in the wrong order. His last sight of his world was the faces of his friends, Uraraka, her hand outstretched, her mouth open in a silent scream, Ida, scrambling to his feet, his expression one of pure horror. Then, everything was pain and noise and falling. The landing was not a landing. It was a cessation of torment. One moment he was being flayed by the universe, the next he was colliding with something solid, the impact driving the air from his lungs in a ragged gasp. He rolled, his training taking over even as his mind reeled, tumbling through damp leaves and soft, loamy earth until he came to a stop against the trunk of a massive tree. For a long minute, he just lay there, every cell in his body screaming in protest. His head throbbed with a migraine that felt like a physical spike driven through his skull. His stomach churned. The scent of ozone from the portal still clung to him, a sickeningly sweet perfume. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up. He was in a forest. But it was unlike any forest he had ever seen. The trees were enormous, their thick, gnarled trunks draped in moss and ivy, their canopies so dense that only mottled shafts of sunlight reached the forest floor. The air was thick, humid, and alive with the smell of damp earth, decaying wood, and 1,000 unknown blossoms. The sounds were alien, the chittering of unfamiliar insects, the calls of birds he couldn't identify. "Uraraka-san? Ida-kun?" he called out, his voice hoarse. "Anyone?" Only the sighing of the wind in the colossal trees answered him. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at the edges of his consciousness. He fought it down, forcing his analytical mind to take over. Okay, think. The villain's quirk sent me somewhere. Is this just another section of the DRC? A new simulation? He checked his earpiece. It was dead, emitting only a faint hiss of static. He looked at his support gear. The full gauntlet on his right arm was cracked and dark, the intricate wiring fried. His hero costume, Gamma, was in tatters, ripped and scoured from his violent transit. He was bruised, bleeding from a dozen small cuts, and his left shoulder felt dangerously loose in its socket. He stumbled to his feet, leaning against the tree for support. The sheer scale of the forest was oppressive. It felt ancient, primeval. There were no signs of civilization, no distant hum of traffic, no faint glow of city lights against the clouds, no contrails scarring the deep blue sky. Nothing. He was truly, utterly alone. The panic returned, stronger this time. His breath hitched, and a wave of vertigo washed over him. He was a 15-year-old boy, injured and lost in a place that felt profoundly wrong. He wanted his mom. He wanted All Might. He wanted to hear Bakugo's infuriating yelling, just to know he wasn't the only person left in the world. He spent what felt like hours wandering, calling out until his throat was raw. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. The forest grew darker, the shadows deepening, and new, more predatory sounds began to emerge from the undergrowth. A distant howl. The snap of a twig too heavy to be a small animal. Fear, a primal and gnawing thing he hadn't felt so acutely in years, settled in his gut. This was no simulation. The pain was too real, the isolation too absolute. It was in the deepening twilight that they found him. He heard them before he saw them, the crunch of heavy boots on fallen leaves, the jingle of metal, and low, guttural voices speaking in a language that sounded vaguely familiar but which he couldn't place. It was harsh, percussive, full of hard consonants. He ducked behind a thicket of ferns, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He peered through the leaves. 3 men emerged into a small clearing. They were burly, bearded, and dressed in rough-spun tunics and worn leather armor. One carried a short, broad-bladed sword, another, a crude spear. They looked like something out of a history book. They stopped, and one of them pointed directly at his hiding place. He'd been spotted. Izuku's mind raced. Villains? Cosplayers? Part of Epic's group? He stood up slowly, raising his hands in a gesture he hoped was universal for I mean no harm. "Hello?" he said, his voice trembling slightly. "Can you help me? I'm lost." The men stared at him. Their eyes raked over his strange, tattered green costume, his wild hair, the bizarre, broken gauntlet on his arm. They exchanged confused, suspicious glances, muttering to each other in that incomprehensible tongue. The one with the sword, clearly the leader, took a step forward. He was a mountain of a man, with a scarred face and a flat, broken nose. He barked a question, his tone aggressive. Izuku shook his head. "I'm sorry, I don't understand." He tried again, pointing to himself. "Izuku Midoriya. I'm from Japan. Nippon. Do you understand?" The word Nippon meant nothing to them. The leader's patience snapped. He barked an order, and the other 2 men began to advance, their weapons held ready. Izuku's instincts screamed at him to fight. 5% of 1 for all would be more than enough to handle them. He could be gone, a green flash in the woods, before they could even react. But then what? He was injured, lost, and had no idea where he was. These men, as threatening as they were the first people he'd seen. Maybe they were just scared. Maybe this was all a misunderstanding. He held his hands up higher. "Please, I don't want to fight." His plea was taken as weakness. The 2 men lunged. He dodged the spear thrust easily, but the second man was faster than he looked, swinging the flat of his blade into Izuku's ribs. The blow wasn't powerful, but it was enough to knock him off balance, his injured shoulder screaming in protest. He stumbled, and in that moment of vulnerability, the leader was on him. A heavy boot kicked his legs out from under him. He hit the ground hard, the impact jarring his teeth. Before he could recover, a knee was planted in his back, and his arms were wrenched behind him. Rough rope, smelling of mildew and sweat, was used to bind his wrists with brutal efficiency. They rolled him over. The leader stood over him, his face a mask of triumphant avarice. He pointed at Izuku's strange costume, at his green hair, and let out a gruff laugh. He said something to his companions that made them grin. The reality of the situation crashed down on Izuku with the weight of a collapsing building. These weren't confused locals. They weren't villains staging an attack. They were slavers. And he was their prize. The dehumanization was swift and absolute. They tore the remnants of his hero costume from his body, leaving him in his shorts and undershirt. They ripped the broken gauntlet from his arm, examining it with greedy curiosity before tossing it aside as useless junk. They ran rough hands over him, checking his teeth and muscle tone as if he were livestock. His panicked Japanese protests, his pleas, were met with cuffs to the head and harsh commands to be silent. Finally, they gagged him with a strip of dirty cloth and threw him into a crude wooden cage on the back of a cart, hidden deeper in the woods. The cage was already occupied by 2 other people, a man with vacant, despairing eyes and a young woman who was crying silently in the corner. The journey was a jarring, miserable blur. The cart bounced over rutted dirt tracks, each jolt sending a fresh wave of agony through Izuku's body. The world he saw through the wooden bars was one of untamed wilderness, gradually giving way to cultivated fields and simple, wattle-and-daub huts. There were no power lines, no paved roads, no cars. It was as if he'd been thrown back in time. The chilling thought, once a fringe possibility, began to solidify into a terrifying certainty. After what must have been a full day of travel, they arrived at a town. It was larger than the villages they'd passed, fortified by a low stone wall. The buildings were made of timber and plaster, with terracotta-tiled roofs. People in tunics and togas bustled through the streets, their language the same harsh, alien tongue the slavers spoke. In the distance, Izuku could see the half-finished construction of what looked like a stone amphitheater. The architecture was unmistakably, terrifyingly, Roman. His heart sank into a pit of ice. Epic hadn't just sent him to another place. He had sent him to another time. The cart clattered to a stop in a dusty, crowded marketplace. The stench of sweat, animals, and refuse was overpowering. Izuku and the other captives were roughly hauled from the cage and shoved onto a raised wooden platform. His gag was removed, but his hands remained bound. An auctioneer, a man with a booming voice and a stained toga, began to shout to the crowd, gesturing at the other captives. Izuku stood there, numb with shock and horror, as people were sold like sacks of grain. The woman from the cage was sold to a fat, leering merchant. The man with the empty eyes was sold to a stern-looking farmer. Then, it was his turn. The auctioneer grabbed him by the hair, forcing his head up. He launched into a loud, energetic speech, pointing out Izuku's strange hair color, his lean but clearly strong build, the unusual patterns of old scars on his arms, souvenirs of 100 training sessions and battles. The crowd murmured, a mixture of curiosity and derision. His odd appearance made him a novelty. He was prodded, his arms were felt, his teeth were inspected again. He felt a profound, soul-crushing humiliation. He was no longer Izuku Midoriya, student at UA High, successor to All Might. He was an object. A piece of property. The bidding began. It was a flurry of words and numbers he couldn't comprehend. He just stood there, his eyes cast down, trying to disappear. Enough, a new voice cut through the din. It was deep, gravelly, and radiated an unquestionable authority. The crowd parted, and a man stepped forward. He was immense, not fat, but built of solid, weathered muscle. A web of old, silvery scars crisscrossed his thick arms and neck. His face was a stern, unreadable mask, his jaw set, and his cold, gray eyes missed nothing. He wore a simple, high-quality dark tunic, but carried himself with the presence of a king. The auctioneer bowed his head obsequiously. The large man ignored him, his gaze fixed solely on Izuku. He walked onto the platform, his heavy leather sandals thudding on the wood. He circled Izuku slowly, his eyes analytical, assessing. He was looking at Izuku not as a curiosity, but as one might inspect a tool, or a weapon. He saw the toned muscles beneath the grime, the calloused hands, the straightness of his back. But most of all, he seemed to focus on Izuku's eyes. Izuku, despite his terror and despair, met his gaze. He didn't know why, but he couldn't look away. He wouldn't. He let the man see the fire that was still banked deep inside him, the ember of defiance that refused to be extinguished. A flicker of something, interest perhaps, passed through the man's stoic expression. He grunted, a sound of decision. He turned to the auctioneer and named a price. It must have been a significant sum, because the auctioneer's eyes went wide, and he immediately slammed his wooden gavel down, closing the sale. The large man tossed a heavy pouch of coins to the slaver captain, who caught it with a greedy grin. Two of the man's guards stepped forward, cutting Izuku's bonds only to replace them with a heavy iron collar and a short length of chain. He was led away from the auction block, the chain held firmly by one of the guards. He was pulled through the crowded streets, a spectacle for the locals. He caught the man's name as the auctioneer called it out in a final, fawning farewell. It was a name that would come to define his new, horrific reality. A fine purchase, Lanista Batiatus. May he serve you well in the Ludus. Izuku didn't understand the words, but the tone was clear. He was a purchase. He belonged to this man, Batiatus, and as he was led towards a large, foreboding compound on the edge of town, a place with high walls and a single, heavily barred gate, he felt the last vestiges of his old life fall away like dust. The hero in training was gone, fallen not in battle, but through time itself. In his place stood only a slave, nameless and alone, being dragged toward a fate he could not yet comprehend, but already knew how to fear. The great wooden gate of the Ludus slammed shut behind Izuku, the sound a heavy, final thud that seemed to sever his last, tenuous thread to the outside world. The noise of the town market was instantly muffled, replaced by a new, more menacing symphony. It was a place of harsh sounds, the rhythmic clang of metal on metal, the wet thud of wooden swords against practiced dummies, the grunts and roars of men locked in strenuous effort, and over it all, the incessant, grating scrape of sandals on sun-baked earth. The compound was a self-contained world of grit and violence. A vast, rectangular courtyard of packed dirt formed its heart, scorched by a sun that seemed to beat down with a personal malevolence. Around its perimeter were long, low buildings of stone and timber, a barracks, a mess hall, an armory, and what looked like a forge from which black smoke curled lazily into the mercilessly blue sky. The air was thick with the smells of sweat, hot metal, stale wine, and something metallic and vaguely sweet that Izuku's mind, in a moment of clinical horror, identified as blood. He was in a cage built for wolves, and he was the only rabbit. His new owner, Batiatus, didn't look at him again. He gestured dismissively to one of his guards, who gave the chain a vicious tug, nearly pulling Izuku off his feet. He was dragged across the courtyard, past pairs of sweating, half-naked men who paused in their mock battles to stare at him. Their eyes were hard, their faces maps of scars and cynical amusement. They saw his strange green hair, his scrawny frame, and the terror that he was sure was written all over his face. He heard a few gruff laughs and a string of words in that harsh, unfamiliar language. He didn't need a translation to understand their meaning. Fresh meat. The guard shoved him towards a stone trough filled with brackish, cold water. An older man, lean and wiry with skin like tanned leather, was overseeing two other new arrivals being scrubbed down with coarse brushes. This man's face was a study in grim resignation. His hair was cropped close to his scalp, revealing a latticework of old scars, and one of his eyes was clouded over with a milky white film. He moved with a stiff, pained grace, and when he turned his good eye on Izuku, it was with a weariness that seemed ancient. Another one, doctor. The guard grunted, shoving Izuku forward. The doctor, looked Izuku up and down. His gaze was not one of malice, but of cold, professional assessment. He saw everything, the fear, yes, but also the wiry muscle of a body honed by relentless training, the way Izuku instinctively kept his balance despite being pushed. Strip him, the doctor ordered, his voice a low rasp, like stones grinding together. Before Izuku could react, the guards tore the remnants of his undershirt and shorts from his body, leaving him naked and shivering under the hot sun. The humiliation was a physical blow, a burning shame that was somehow worse than the fear. He was exposed, vulnerable, less than human. The doctor circled him, prodding his shoulders, checking the muscles in his legs, forcing his mouth open to inspect his teeth. It was the same degrading inspection from the marketplace, but this time it felt colder, more purposeful. He's lean, the doctor grumbled to Batiatus, who had approached to observe. Quick, maybe. But there's no muscle on him. He'll break in the first real match, Batiatus grunted. The crowd found him novel. A curiosity might earn back its price before it dies. Get him marked and quartered. With that, Batiatus turned and strode towards a larger building that was clearly his personal residence, leaving Izuku to his fate. The doctor sighed, a sound of profound boredom, and gestured to a nearby fire pit where a burly, bald man was tending to a set of branding irons. Panic, stark and absolute, seized Izuku. He understood what was coming. He tried to pull back, to struggle, but the two guards were immensely strong. They slammed him face down onto a rough wooden table, the splintered surface digging into his skin. One guard held his legs, the other pinned his shoulders. He could feel the heat of the approaching iron on his back. He squeezed his eyes shut, his mind screaming. This wasn't a fight he could win. He couldn't use one for all, not just because his body was still too fragile for a high output, but because revealing such power here, in this place, felt like a death sentence of a different kind. He would become more than a curiosity. He would become a monster, a demon to be feared and destroyed. His only option was to endure. The brand touched his skin, just below his left shoulder blade. The world dissolved into pure, white-hot agony. A scream was torn from his throat, muffled by the rough wood of the table. The smell of his own burning flesh filled his nostrils, a uniquely horrifying scent that would haunt his nightmares for years to come. It lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When the iron was pulled away, leaving a throbbing, searing pain in its wake, something inside him had been irrevocably broken and remade. The brand was a mark of ownership, a seal of his new reality. Izuku Midoriya, the boy who dreamed of being a hero, had been burned away. In his place was only this, a slave, a piece of property marked with the emblem of his master, a stylized wolf's head. He was unceremoniously hauled to his feet, his vision swimming. The doctor tossed a coarse, sleeveless, knee-length tunic at him. It was the color of undyed wool, rough and scratchy against his raw skin. It was a slave's uniform. "Put it on," the doctor rasped. "That is all you own now." Dazed and in agony, Izuku pulled the tunic over his head. A new set of manacles, lighter than the transport ones but no less solid, were clamped on his wrists, connected by a short chain. He was then shoved towards the barracks, a long, dark hall lined with cramped, doorless cells. The stench of unwashed bodies, stale sweat, and despair was suffocating. His cell was a narrow space carved from stone, barely large enough for a man to lie down. It contained a thin straw pallet and a wooden bucket for waste. The guard unchained one of his manacles and looped the chain through a thick iron ring set into the wall, then clamped it shut again. He was tethered like an animal. The guard left without a word, and Izuku was alone in the suffocating darkness, the searing pain of the brand the only thing that felt real. He slumped onto the pallet, curled into a ball, and for the first time since he'd arrived in this nightmare, he allowed the tears to come. They were silent, hot tears of pain, of loss, of a hopelessness so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down on his chest, threatening to crush the very breath from his lungs. The days that followed blurred into a monotonous cycle of misery. Life in the Ludus of Batiatus was governed by a brutal, simple rhythm, the clang of a bell before dawn, a meager breakfast of stale bread and watered-down porridge, a morning of grueling physical labor, a brief and tasteless midday meal, an afternoon of weapons training, a final, often bloody sparring session, and then confinement in the cells until the next morning. The physical labor was designed to break the body and the spirit. Izuku and the other new recruits, the Tyrones, were tasked with the most demeaning jobs, mucking out the latrines, turning the massive stone wheel of the grain mill until their muscles screamed, and carrying heavy stones back and forth across the yard for no reason other than to exhaust them. It was during the first weapons training that he truly understood the depth of his predicament. The doctor, whose name he learned was Cassius, stood before the new recruits, his one good eye scanning them with undisguised contempt. "Here you are nothing," Cassius began, his voice carrying easily across the yard. Another, older slave with a scarred face stood beside him, translating his Latin into a crude mishmash of Gaulish, Germanic, and Greek for the benefit of the diverse group of captives. Izuku, through sheer desperation, began to pick out key words. Pugnate. Fight. Vincere. Win. Mori. Die. Your past lives are dust. Cassius continued, his gaze lingering on Izuku for a moment. Your gods cannot hear you. Your families have forgotten you. The only thing that matters is the sand beneath your feet, the weapon in your hand, and the man opposite you who wants to kill you. Here you will learn how to kill him first. If you learn well, you may earn glory. You may earn coin. You may even, one day, earn your freedom. But most of you will just die. It makes no difference to me. Now pick up a Ludus and a scutum." Wooden training swords and simple rectangular shields were kicked towards them. Izuku picked one up. The shield felt heavy and awkward, the sword clumsy in his hand. His own fighting style, the one he had painstakingly developed with all might, was based on mobility, precision strikes with his hands and feet, and the use of shoot style to minimize damage to his own body. It was a hero's martial art, designed to incapacitate, not to kill. It was utterly, pathetically useless here. His first opponent was a barrel-chested German with arms like tree trunks. The man roared and charged, shield held high. Izuku instinctively dropped into a low stance, looking for an opening to exploit, a joint to lock. But the German didn't fight with technique. He fought with pure brute force. He smashed his shield into Izuku's, the impact jarring him to the bone and sending him stumbling backward. Before Izuku could recover, the flat of the German's wooden sword slammed into the side of his head. He hit the dirt, his ears ringing. Laughter echoed around the yard. "On your feet, boy!" Cassius barked. "The sand is for dead men." Izuku scrambled up, his head throbbing. He tried a different approach. He dodged the next clumsy swing, using his superior agility. He saw an opening and darted in, aiming a precise, open-palm strike at the German's sword wrist, a classic disarming technique. His hand connected, but it was like striking a stone wall. The German barely grunted, then backhanded him across the face, sending him sprawling once more. "What was that?" Cassius bellowed, striding over to him. He punctuated his question with a sharp crack of his own Ludus against Izuku's knuckles. Pain flared through his hand. "Are you trying to tickle him? You have a sword. It is for stabbing and for cutting. It is not a decoration. Use it." The afternoon was a relentless series of humiliations. He was too small to overpower anyone, and his modern martial arts were completely unsuited for this kind of combat. A shield wasn't just a defensive tool. It was a weapon, used for bashing and unbalancing. A sword wasn't for finesse. It was for gutting a man who was trying to do the same to you. Every instinct he had, to minimize harm, to avoid vital areas, to subdue rather than maim, was a liability. It was during this session that he first truly noticed the Ludus champion. While the recruits were being battered and bruised, the veteran gladiators, the veterani, were engaged in more serious, skillful sparring on the other side of the yard. And one man stood out among them all. He was a giant, even bigger than the German who had first knocked Izuku down. His hair was a wild mane of fiery red, and his body was a terrifying landscape of corded muscle and thick, ropey scars. He fought with a large, oblong shield and a gladius, the short, stabbing sword of the Roman legions. This was Valerius, the Gaul. He moved with a shocking, brutal grace for a man his size. Every step was deliberate, every shield bash was a thunderclap, every sword thrust was a piston of death. He was sparring with two other gladiators at once, and he was winning. He disarmed one with a powerful shield hook, then drove the other to his knees with a relentless flurry of blows. He stood over his defeated opponents, chest heaving, a look of supreme, arrogant pride on his face. His gaze swept across the yard and fell upon Izuku, who was just picking himself up from the dust again. Valerius let out a short, contemptuous laugh. He said something to the man beside him, who snickered in response. Izuku didn't need the words translated. The Gaul's sneer was a universal language. Weakling. Pathetic. Rabbit. Later that day, nursing a collection of fresh bruises and a deep cut on his forearm, Izuku was shoved into a small, torchlit room that served as the Ludus infirmary. It was there he met her. A young woman with dark, wary eyes and long, braided brown hair was grinding herbs in a stone bowl. She moved with a quiet efficiency, her face calm amidst the groans of the injured men around her. She was a slave, like him, but she carried herself with a quiet dignity that seemed impossible in this place. She gestured for him to sit on a stool, and he obeyed. She didn't speak, but began to clean the gash on his arm with a cloth dipped in wine, her touch surprisingly gentle. The sting made him hiss in pain. Her eyes met his for a fraction of a second. He saw no pity in them, but something else, empathy. a shared understanding of their captive state. "You fight with your head, not your gut," she said, her voice a soft murmur. Her accent was strange, melodic. The words were in broken, heavily accented Latin, but he understood them. It was one of the first full sentences directed at him that wasn't an order or an insult. Izuku blinked, surprised. I don't know how to fight like them." She finished cleaning the wound and began to wrap it with a clean linen bandage. "Then you will die," she said, not with cruelty, but with a simple, matter-of-fact sadness. She paused, then pressed a small, slightly bruised apple into his hand, closing his fingers around it. It was a gesture so small, so human, it almost brought him to tears. "Eat," she whispered. "You will need your strength." "I am Livia." "Arigato," he started, then caught himself. "Thank you?" "I am Izuku." She gave him a small, sad smile and then turned to the next injured man, her moment of kindness already over. Izuku stared at the apple in his hand. It was the first act of genuine compassion he had received since he had fallen into this savage time. It was a tiny beacon of light in an endless, suffocating darkness. Her name was Livia. He wouldn't forget it. That night, lying on his straw pallet, the pain in his body was a dull, constant throb. But it was the pain in his spirit that truly tormented him. Despair was a cold, heavy blanket, smothering all hope. He was trapped. 1,000 years, 1,000,000 miles from everyone he knew and loved. He had no quirk he could safely use, no allies, no knowledge of this world. His skills were worthless. He was just a boy, small and weak, in a world that only respected brutal strength. Cassius was right. He was going to die here. He would be thrown into an arena, and some monster like Valerius would cut him down for the entertainment of a screaming mob, and his life would just end. His dream of becoming a hero, his promise to All Might, everything he had worked for, would be for nothing. He would die a slave, forgotten by time. The weight of it all was crushing. He turned his face to the cold stone wall, a sob catching in his throat. It was hopeless. He was a failure. He was already dead. He must have drifted into a fitful, exhausted sleep, because he was startled awake by a noise from the courtyard. It was late. The moon was high in the sky, casting long, skeletal shadows across the sand. A single figure was moving in the center of the yard, lit by the pale moonlight. It was Valerius. The champion of the Ludus was not sleeping. He was training. Alone. He moved through a series of forms, his massive body a silhouette of controlled power. He lunged, he parried an imaginary foe, he spun, his gladius a silver arc in the moonlight. Izuku watched, his despair momentarily forgotten, replaced by a deep-seated, analytical curiosity he couldn't suppress. He pushed himself up, creeping to the edge of his cell to get a better view through the bars. He wasn't just watching the Gaul fight. He was analyzing him. The familiar, compulsive habit, the one his classmates had always teased him for, kicked in. His mind, starved for the complex data it was used to processing, latched onto Valerius's movements with a desperate hunger. The muttering began, a barely audible whisper in the confines of his cell. "He's powerful, incredibly so. But his style is all aggression. All forward momentum." Valerius executed a powerful overhead chop, bringing his practiced sword down with enough force to split a man's skull. But look! That chop! He has to plant his feet wide to maintain his balance. His entire left side, from his hip to his armpit, is exposed for a full second. A quick thrust under the shield arm would be almost impossible to block from that stance. The Gaul transitioned into a defensive posture, shield held tight. He keeps his shield too high when he's expecting a blow to the head. He's confident in his ability to block, but it lifts the bottom edge. His lead leg, the calf and ankle are vulnerable. He favors his right leg for pivots, meaning a low, sweeping attack on his left could destabilize him completely. Valerius spun, swinging his sword in a wide, horizontal arc. That swing is too wide. It's for intimidation, to force an opponent back. But it's slow to recover from. If you could duck under it, get inside his guard. He's too big to fight effectively at close quarters. His size becomes a hindrance. On and on it went. The words tumbled out of him, a quiet, frantic litany of weaknesses, tells, and tactical openings. He wasn't seeing an unstoppable champion anymore. He was seeing a collection of data points. He was seeing a problem to be solved. A profound, electrifying realization shot through him, chasing away the cold shadows of despair. They had taken his costume. They had taken his name. They had taken his freedom. In this world, one for all was a secret he had to keep buried, a sealed weapon too dangerous to reveal. They had left him with nothing. But they were wrong. They hadn't taken his mind. They hadn't taken his greatest weapon, his obsessive, relentless, heroic analysis. It was the skill he had honed for a decade before he'd ever had a quirk, the very foundation of his being. In a world of brute force, it was a weapon they wouldn't even recognize. Lying there in the dark, bruised and branded, a prisoner in a savage past, Izuku Midoriya finally stopped thinking about how he was going to die. For the first time, he started thinking about how he was going to survive. The clang of the morning bell was no longer just a summons to another day of misery. It was a starting gun. As Izuku was unchained from the wall of his cell, a new, cold fire burned in his gut, a stark contrast to the smoldering despair of the day before. The pain from his bruises and the searing brand on his back was still a constant, nagging reality, but it was no longer the sole focus of his existence. It was now just data, a reminder of his own physical limitations, another variable in a complex and deadly equation. His world had shrunk to the four walls of the Ludus, but his perception of it had expanded exponentially. He was no longer a captive waiting for death. He was a student in the most brutal school he could imagine, and his survival depended on learning faster than anyone else. Breakfast was the same tasteless porridge, but today, Izuku wasn't just shoveling it down. He was observing. He watched the way the bigger gladiators, the Gauls and Germans like Valerius, instinctively took the largest portions, reinforcing the simple, brutal hierarchy. He saw the quieter, leaner men, Thracians, Syrians, Greeks, eating slowly, deliberately, conserving their energy. He noticed the subtle alliances and rivalries, a shared piece of bread here, a threatening glare over a spilled drop of water there. This entire compound was a microcosm of the arena, a daily, low-stakes battle for dominance and resources. Every interaction was a potential lesson. The morning's labor was turning the grain mill. It was torturous work. He and 3 other Tyrones were chained to the massive wooden arms of the millstone, forced to walk in an endless, mind-numbing circle, pushing the heavy beam that turned the stone. The air in the stone chamber was thick with flour dust and the smell of sweat. The muscles in his legs and back burned, protesting with every step. Yesterday, he had focused only on the pain, on the exhaustion. Today, his mind was busy. He analyzed the movements of the man in front of him, a lanky youth from Britannia with fear in his eyes. The boy pushed inefficiently, putting all the strain on his lower back, his steps uneven. Izuku adjusted his own posture, sinking his weight, pushing from his core and legs just as he'd been taught in his martial arts training. It was still grueling, but he found a rhythm, a way to conserve his strength, to make every ounce of effort count. He was learning to be efficient in a world that demanded everything from him. He even found himself studying the doctor, Cassius, who stood watching them, his arms crossed, his one good eye missing nothing. Cassius didn't just enforce discipline with his rudis. His presence alone was a lesson. He stood with a perfect economy of motion, his weight balanced, his posture relaxed but ready. Izuku realized he was looking at a man whose body was a living library of combat. Every scar told a story, every limp was the result of a past mistake. Cassius wasn't just a trainer, he was a survivor, and Izuku began to watch him with the same intensity he did Valerius. When the afternoon training session began, Izuku's entire demeanor had changed. He no longer walked onto the hot sand with the shuffling gait of a condemned man. He walked with purpose. His eyes, clear and green, were no longer wide with fear, but narrowed in intense concentration, sweeping across the yard, absorbing everything. "You boy with the weed hair," Cassius barked, pointing his wooden sword at Izuku. "You're with me today." A murmur went through the other recruits. Being singled out by the doctor for personal training was either a great honor or a death sentence. Izuku felt a jolt of apprehension, but he squashed it down. This was an opportunity. He picked up his training shield and sword and approached the veteran gladiator. "Your footwork is atrocious," Cassius began, circling him like a shark. You move like a startled goat. You leap and bounce. The sand is treacherous. One misplaced step, and you are dead. Show me your stance. Izuku adopted the basic fighting stance he'd been taught, feet apart, knees bent, shield forward. Cassius scoffed. Pathetic. That is a legionary stance for fighting in a line. You are not in a line. You are alone. In the arena, you are always alone. Widen your base. Lower your center of gravity. No, lower. Feel the sand. Become part of it. He kicked Izuku's feet into a wider, deeper stance. It felt awkward, slow, but undeniably more stable. Now your shield. Cassius continued, wrapping his rudis against Izuku's scutum. You hold it out like a serving platter. It is not an invitation. It is a wall. Keep it close. Let your body move with it. It is an extension of your arm, not a burden you carry. For the next hour, Cassius broke him down. He didn't spar with Izuku. He tormented him. He used only the tip of his wooden sword, tapping and prodding at every opening Izuku left. A tap to the exposed ribs when Izuku's shield arm drifted too high. A tap to the back of the knee when his stance wavered. A tap to the throat when he raised his chin. Each tap was a lesson, a painful, stinging reminder of a fatal mistake. Izuku didn't win a single exchange. He didn't even land a blow. But he was learning. His mind was racing, cataloging every one of Cassius's movements, every piece of advice. He attacks the line of my advance. He uses feints to draw my shield out of position. His own movements are minimal, a slight shift of the hips, a turn of the wrist. You are thinking too much. Cassius growled, slapping the flat of his sword against Izuku's helmeted head. The impact rattled his teeth. In the arena, there is no time to think. There is only time to react. But if I don't think, I'm dead, Izuku muttered, more to himself than to his trainer. He's bigger than me. They're all bigger than me. I can't win with strength. Cassius paused. It was the first time Izuku had spoken more than a single word to him. The doctor stared at him, his good eye narrowing. So you have a brain in that strange head of yours after all? He rasped. Good. It might keep you alive for a week. You are right, boy. You are a rabbit in a den of wolves. If you try to fight a wolf like a wolf, you will be torn apart. So, you must fight like a rabbit. You must be quicker. You must be smarter. And you must be more desperate. He raised his sword again. Again, the brutal lesson continued. By the time the bell rang to signal the end of training, Izuku was covered in sweat and red welts. Every muscle ached, but as he limped away, he felt a strange sense of accomplishment. He had survived a direct encounter with the doctor, and he had learned more in that hour than in all the previous days combined. He spent the rest of the day in a state of hyper-awareness. He wasn't just watching Valerius anymore. He was studying everyone. He watched the Rediarius, a fisherman from Greece named Lycomedes, practicing with his net and trident. He saw the fluid, dance-like steps, the way he used the entire training area, creating distance, always moving. Lesson: control the space of the fight. Don't let the opponent dictate the range. He watched a pair of Demicari, Thracian brothers who fought with 2 swords each. Their style was a dizzying whirlwind of offense, but Izuku saw the weakness. They had no shield. Their defense was their attack. Lesson: a relentless offense can be a poor defense. Weather the storm, and the opponent will exhaust himself and create an opening. He even studied the heavily armored Murmillo, a Samnite war captive named Neas, whose massive helmet, shield, and greaves made him a walking fortress. He was slow, a juggernaut of bronze and steel. Lesson: armor provides protection, but it restricts movement and vision. Speed can defeat strength. Agility can defeat armor. He began to create a mental catalog, a version of his old hero analysis notebooks that existed only in his mind. He assigned fighters classes based on their equipment and style: Murmillo, Rediarius, Thraex, Hoplomachus. He broke down their individual strengths and weaknesses. He ran endless simulations in his head, pitting one style against another, looking for the tactical fulcrum that could turn a fight. His constant, quiet muttering returned. During meals, during labor, during the brief moments of rest, he would whisper to himself in Japanese, his brow furrowed in concentration. The other gladiators gave him a wide berth. They thought he was weak in the head, driven mad by fear. They started calling him names. Muska, the fly, because of his constant buzzing. Umbra, the shadow, because of his quiet, intense observation. The nicknames were meant as insults, but Izuku barely noticed. He was too busy learning. A few days later, Cassius decided the Tyrones were ready for their first taste of proper, armored sparring. They were given blunted metal weapons and real, albeit battered armor. The extra weight was staggering. Izuku was outfitted in the light armor of a Thraex, a small, square shield, parmula, a helmet with a wide brim and a stylized griffin on the crest, and a curved, sickle-like sword called a sika. His opponent was the same brawny German who had humiliated him on his first day. The German was equipped as a hoplomachus, with a larger shield, a spear, and a dagger. A classic pairing. Range against speed. The German grinned, showing a row of yellow teeth. He clearly expected a repeat of their first encounter. "Begin!" Cassius bellowed. The German charged, just as before, spear leveled. But this time, Izuku was ready. He didn't try to meet the charge head-on. Remembering Cassius's words, he used his lighter weight to his advantage. He sidestepped, letting the German's momentum carry him past. As the big man lumbered by, Izuku used the curved point of his sika to hook the back of the German's knee, a move he'd seen a Thracian veteran use. The German roared in surprise as his leg buckled, sending him stumbling. It wasn't a crippling blow, but it broke his charge and his confidence. Enraged, the German discarded his spear and drew his dagger, closing the distance. Izuku was forced back, the German's superior strength pushing him across the sand. Shield crashed against shield. The German was a wall of muscle, trying to simply crush Izuku through sheer force. But Izuku wasn't fighting the German's strength. He was fighting his balance. He remembered his analysis of Valerius. They plant their feet for power. He weathered a heavy shield bash, absorbing the impact by letting it push him back a step instead of resisting it. The German, overcommit, leaned forward. It was a fractional, momentary imbalance, but it was the opening Izuku had been waiting for. He didn't push back. He pulled. He hooked his shield around the edge of the German's and yanked, using the big man's own forward momentum against him. At the same time, he swept his leg out. The German, caught completely by surprise by the unorthodox tactic, let out a startled cry and crashed onto his back with a heavy thud that shook the ground. Izuku was on him in an instant, the blunted tip of his sika pressed against the German's throat through the gap in his helmet. The entire training yard fell silent. The German lay there, stunned and defeated. The other gladiators stared, their mocking sneers replaced by expressions of shock and disbelief. Even Valerius, who had been watching with casual disdain, raised an eyebrow. Izuku's heart was hammering. His lungs burned. He had won. He hadn't used a single shred of his quirk. He had won with his mind. Cassius strode over, his face an unreadable mask. He looked down at the defeated German, then at Izuku, who was still holding his blade to the man's throat, his arm trembling with adrenaline. "Get off him, boy!" Cassius grunted. "The match is over." Izuku scrambled back, his mind still reeling. Cassius nudged the German with his boot. "On your feet, you useless ox! You were beaten by a rabbit. Let that be a lesson to you. The most dangerous opponent is the one you underestimate." He then turned his gaze to Izuku. His one good eye seemed to bore right through him. For a moment, Izuku thought he was going to be punished for his unconventional methods. Instead, the corner of the doctor's mouth twitched, a minuscule, almost imperceptible movement that might have been the ghost of a smile. "Not bad, boy," he rasped. "Your strength is pathetic. Your technique is inventive. But your brain is sharp. Perhaps you won't die in the first week after all." It was the highest form of praise Izuku had received in this place, and it felt more valuable than any trophy. He had earned a sliver of respect, not with power, but with intellect. The dynamic in the yard had shifted. The other gladiators still saw him as small, as an oddity, but now there was a flicker of caution in their eyes. The fly had developed a sting. The shadow had gained teeth. That evening, Livia was tending to a cut on his cheek. Her touch was gentle as always. "I heard you defeated Odo," she said softly, her eyes focused on her work. Odo, he now knew, was the German's name. News in the Ludus traveled fast. "I was lucky," Izuku replied, wincing as she applied a salve. "It was not luck," she corrected him, her gaze meeting his. There was a glimmer of something new in her expression, not just empathy, but a fragile spark of hope. "It was cleverness. I have seen many clever men come to this place. Most of them die just like the strong ones." "Then what's the difference?" Izuku asked, his voice low. "The strong fight to dominate. The clever fight to survive," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "But I think you are fighting for something else. I do not know what it is. But I see it in your eyes." She finished her work and moved away, leaving Izuku to ponder her words. What am I fighting for? Survival, yes. The desperate, primal need to see another sunrise. But was that all? No. He looked at Livia, at the resigned despair in the eyes of the boy from Britannia, at the brutalized bodies of the men who were treated as less than animals. He wasn't just fighting for himself. He was a hero. That core, unshakable truth remained, even here. A hero saves people. He couldn't save everyone, not in this savage world. He couldn't even save himself right now. But maybe he could show them that there was another way. Maybe he could survive without becoming a monster. Maybe he could bring a spark of hope into this hopeless place. He was fighting to hold on to the person he was, the hero he still dreamed of becoming. His resolve hardened. This was no longer just about survival. It was about proving that a hero's spirit could endure, even on the blood-soaked sands of the arena. The final test of his new strategy came at the end of the week. Beatrice, having heard of the boy's surprising progress, decided it was time to see if his investment was worth anything. He stood on the balcony of his residence, overlooking the courtyard, a cup of wine in his hand. "The green-haired one," he announced, his voice booming across the yard. "And you, Valerius. Spar. First to be disarmed or yield loses." A collective gasp went through the gladiators. Pitting the Ludus champion against the newest, scrawniest recruit was unheard of. It wasn't a match, it was an execution. Valerius grinned, a savage, predatory expression. He cracked his thick neck and picked up his training sword and shield, relishing the opportunity to put this clever little upstart back in his place. Izuku's blood ran cold. This was not Odo. This was the beast he had studied from the shadows, the apex predator of the Ludus. All his analysis, all his theories, were about to be put to the ultimate test. He took a deep breath, picked up his Thraix equipment, and walked to the center of the yard to face the giant. He felt the familiar thrum of fear, but it was accompanied now by the cold, clear focus of his analytical mind. "Try not to cry when you lose, little rabbit," Valerius sneered. Cassius stood between them. "Begin!" he roared. Valerius didn't hesitate. He charged, a mountain of muscle and fury, his shield raised like the prow of a warship. Izuku knew he couldn't take the impact. He did the only thing he could, he ran. He dodged to the side, forcing the massive Gaul to halt his charge and turn. Izuku kept moving, circling, using the entire yard. Valerius roared in frustration, chasing him, but Izuku was faster, more agile. The crowd of gladiators jeered, calling him a coward, but Izuku wasn't running from the fight. He was controlling it. He was forcing Valerius to fight on his terms, to expend energy, to grow angry and reckless. He was gathering data, watching the Gaul's every step, every shift of his shield. Finally, Valerius had enough. He feigned a charge, then stopped, correctly predicting Izuku's dodge. As Izuku darted to the side, Valerius was already moving, his shield slamming into Izuku's side with the force of a battering ram. Pain exploded in Izuku's ribs. He was thrown to the ground, the air knocked from his lungs. Valerius stood over him, raising his sword for the final, humiliating blow. But even as he fell, Izuku's mind was working. He'd seen it in his moonlit observations. That overhead chop, he plants his feet wide. As Valerius brought his sword down, Izuku, still on the ground, didn't try to block it. He rolled violently inward, under the Gaul's guard, into the space right beside his planted feet. The Gaul's sword slammed into the empty sand. Izuku was now too close for Valerius to bring his sword or shield to bear effectively. With a desperate surge of strength, Izuku slammed the reinforced edge of his own small shield into the side of Valerius's knee, his less stable left leg. Valerius grunted in pain, his leg buckling slightly. It wasn't a serious blow, but it was enough. His balance was compromised. Izuku used the curved tip of his sika, not as a weapon, but as a hook. He snagged the leather straps on the back of Valerius's massive shield, and pulled with every ounce of his strength. The combination of the blow to the knee and the unexpected pull on his shield was too much. The giant, the champion, the unstoppable force of the Ludus, staggered. He took a clumsy step back to regain his footing, his sword arm flailing for balance. And in that single, fleeting moment of chaos, Izuku acted. He scrambled to his feet, darted forward, and slapped the flat of his sword against the back of Valerius's sword hand. It wasn't a powerful strike, but the champion's grip was already loose from his stumble. The heavy training gladius slipped from his fingers and clattered into the sand. Silence. Valerius froze, his eyes wide with disbelief, staring at his empty hand. Izuku stood panting, his sides screaming in agony, his blunted sword held in a trembling but ready grip. He hadn't beaten Valerius. He hadn't overpowered him, or wounded him. He had simply outthought him. From the balcony, Batiatus slowly, deliberately, began to clap. The sound echoed in the stunned silence of the yard. Valerius looked from his empty hand to Izuku, his expression a mixture of fury and a dawning, grudging respect. Izuku hadn't just survived. He had frustrated the Ludus champion. He had proven his theory. Batiatus, annoyed by his new slave's poor performance at first, now saw potential. He had bought a rabbit, but it seemed this rabbit had the mind of a fox. He decided then and there, it was time to see what this strange boy could do in a real arena, with real stakes. It was time to throw him into a first-blood match, a test to either season him into a profitable gladiator, or get rid of a failed experiment. The boy would either forge himself in the fire, or be consumed by it. And either way, Batiatus would be entertained. The week following his sparring match with Valerius was a strange purgatory. The other gladiators no longer looked at Izuku with open contempt, but with a wary, confused respect that was almost more unnerving. He was an anomaly, a puzzle they couldn't solve. He ate alone, his mind a constant whirl of tactical simulations, his eyes always scanning, observing, learning. Valerius ignored him completely, the Gaul's pride too wounded to even acknowledge his existence, which Izuku counted as a small blessing. Cassius, however, intensified his training. The doctor seemed to have accepted Izuku's unique approach and began to hone it, teaching him not how to be stronger, but how to be smarter. He taught Izuku how to read the subtle shifts in an opponent's shoulders that betrayed their next move, how to use the glare of the sun as a weapon, how to kick sand to momentarily blind a foe. They were dirty tricks, the tools of a survivor, not a proud warrior, and Izuku absorbed them all with a desperate hunger. Then, the day came. It wasn't announced with any fanfare. During the midday meal, a guard simply approached him, unlocked the chain from his wrist, and grunted, "Batiatus wants you." "It's time." A cold dread, familiar and sharp, washed over Izuku. He knew what this meant. He was being sent to the arena. This wasn't training anymore. There would be no blunted swords. No mercy. He was led from the Ludus, blinking in the bright sunlight. The town of Capua was bustling, and the sounds and smells of life, baking bread, laughing children, haggling merchants, seemed alien and dreamlike. It was a world he could see and hear, but was no longer a part of. He was being marched to his potential death, a ghost walking among the living. The local arena was a modest, provincial affair compared to the grand amphitheaters of Rome he'd seen in textbooks, but to Izuku, it was the most terrifying structure he had ever witnessed. It was an oval of stone and wood, rising 3 stories high, a monument to organized brutality. The roar of a crowd already gathered within was a low, bestial hum that he could feel in his bones. He was led not through the main entrance, but down a dark, sloping ramp into the guts of the building. The air grew cool and damp, thick with the smell of stale fear, sweat, and something else, the coppery tang of old blood that had soaked into the very earth and stone. This was the Porta Libidinensis, the gate of death, through which the dead and defeated were dragged. The space beneath the stands was a labyrinth of dark tunnels and holding cells. Torches cast long, flickering shadows on the damp stone walls. The sounds were more distinct here, the anxious snarling of caged beasts, the clank of armor, the low prayers of condemned men, and the ever-present, muffled roar of the crowd above, a beast waiting to be fed. Izuku was shoved into a small, dark cell with several other men. They were not gladiators. Their eyes were wide with terror, their bodies gaunt and unconditioned. They were criminals, Noxii, condemned to die in the arena for the morning's entertainment. One man was weeping openly, another was rocking back and forth, muttering to himself. Izuku's presence, clad in a gladiator's simple subligaculum, loincloth, marked him as something different. They looked at him with a mixture of awe and fear, as if he were both their executioner and their comrade in condemnation. He sat in the corner, trying to control his breathing, to force down the bile rising in his throat. He thought of his friends. He thought of Uraraka's bright smile, of Ida's earnest chopping motions, of Todoroki's quiet strength. He thought of All Might's booming laugh. They felt like figures from a half-forgotten myth, impossibly distant. He was so utterly, terrifyingly alone. You can do this, he told himself, the words a desperate mantra. You've analyzed. You've prepared. Fight like a rabbit. Survive. An eternity later, the cell door grated open. A Lanista's assistant, a man with a bored expression and a checklist, read from a scroll. Crixus the Gaul. For the beast hunt. A massive, terrified man was dragged out. A few minutes later, a horrifying roar, followed by a human scream and the triumphant cheer of the crowd, echoed down the corridor. The process repeated. Men were led out, and screams followed. The number of occupants in the cell dwindled. Finally, the assistant stood at the door and called out, the new one. Voridus. Izuku froze. Voridus. The green one. It was the name Batiatus had given him, a mocking descriptor of his hair. That was who he was now. Not Deku. Not Midoriya. Just Voridus. He stood up on trembling legs and walked out of the cell. He was led to a small alcove where his armor and weapons were laid out. It was the bare minimum. A simple bronze helmet, a Gallia, that left his face exposed. A small round shield, a parma, barely large enough to cover his torso. And a gladius, the classic Roman short sword. It felt shockingly heavy and real in his hand, its edges honed to a razor sharpness. As a guard strapped the leather bindings of the shield to his arm, Izuku's heart hammered so hard he felt it might burst from his chest. The gate, a heavy wooden portcullis, was being raised with a groaning of chains. Beyond it, Izuku could see a rectangle of brilliant, blinding light. The roar of the crowd intensified, a wave of pure, undiluted bloodlust. Your opponent is Scorus, the assistant said, not even bothering to look at him. A murderer from Brundisium. Sentenced to death in the arena. Batiatus wants first blood. Make it quick, boy. Or he will. First blood. Not a fight to the death, necessarily. The first man to draw a significant wound from the other would be declared the winner. It was a small mercy, but in this place, it felt like a lifeline. The gate was fully open. A guard gave him a hard shove. Go on. Earn your keep or die. Izuku stumbled forward, out of the darkness and into the sun. The light was blinding, the heat oppressive. The arena was a circle of packed, blood-darkened sand, surrounded by the rising stone seats packed with a screaming, jeering mob. The sheer sensory overload was staggering. The roar of thousands of voices, the stench of sweat and spilled wine, the glare of the sun off the sand, it all hit him like a physical blow. He felt small, insignificant, a tiny insect under the gaze of 1,000 hungry gods. Across the arena, another gate opened, and his opponent emerged. Scorus was everything Izuku had feared. He was a mountain of a man, his body a canvas of crude prison tattoos and knotted, brutish muscle. His face was a mask of pure, animalistic rage, his eyes bloodshot and crazed. He was armed with a massive, crude, double-bit axe, a weapon of pure butchery. This was not a soldier, or a warrior. This was a rabid dog let off its leash. The crowd roared its approval. They saw the contrast immediately, the hulking, savage brute against the scrawny, green-haired boy. It was a classic, David and Goliath setup, and they clearly favored Goliath. Laughter and insults rained down from the stands. Izuku heard the name they'd given him being shouted, twisted into a joke. Look at the little cuniculus. The rabbit. Scorus will snap him in two. The name stuck. Cuniculus. The rabbit. Izuku's hands, slick with sweat, tightened on the hilt of his sword and the grip of his shield. Let them call him a rabbit. Cassius's words echoed in his mind. You must fight like a rabbit. A trumpet blared, the signal to begin. Scorus let out a guttural, terrifying roar and charged. He didn't run with any sort of tactical awareness. It was a straight, wild, headlong rush, his huge axe held high, ready to cleave Izuku in two. Izuku's training, both from UA and the Ludus, took over. The roar of the crowd faded into a dull drone. The world narrowed to the sand, his opponent, and the angles of attack. He did not meet the charge. He dodged. He sidestepped, his lighter frame allowing him a burst of speed the lumbering Scorus couldn't match. The axe came whistling down, missing him by inches and burying itself deep in the sand. Scorus roared in frustration, wrenching the heavy weapon free. Izuku didn't attack. He backed away, creating distance, his eyes scanning, analyzing. He's all strength. No technique. He's relying on one big, killing blow. His stamina will be poor. His footwork is non-existent. Scorus charged again, swinging his axe in a wide, horizontal arc. Izuku dropped, letting the deadly weapon whistle over his head. The wind from its passage stirred his hair. He could feel the raw, untamed power behind it. A direct hit, even on his shield, would shatter his arm. He scrambled back to his feet, heart pounding. The crowd was starting to get restless. They wanted blood, not a chase. Their jeers grew louder. Fight, you coward! Stand still and die like a man. Izuku ignored them. This wasn't a performance for them. This was about survival. He continued his strategy of evasion, forcing Scorus to chase him around the arena under the baking sun. The big man was already starting to sweat heavily, his breathing growing ragged. His wild swings became slower, more desperate. Izuku knew he couldn't evade forever. He needed to create an opportunity. He needed to use the environment itself as a weapon, just as Cassius had taught him. He glanced around the arena. The sand, the walls, the sun. These were his tools. His next move was a calculated risk. As Scorus charged for a third time, Izuku stood his ground until the last possible second. Then, instead of dodging, he dropped to one knee and kicked. He didn't aim for the man, but for the sand at his feet. A huge spray of sand and grit flew up, directly into the charging brute's face. Scorus bellowed in pain and fury, stumbling to a halt, clawing at his eyes. It was the opening Izuku needed. He surged forward, not with his sword, but with his shield. He slammed the bronze boss of the Parma into Scorus's knee. The man roared, his leg buckling. It was the same move he'd used on Valerius, but this time it was born of desperate necessity. Scorus, blinded and injured, swung his axe wildly. Izuku ducked under the clumsy attack and, for the first time, used his sword. He didn't aim for a killing blow. He aimed for the man's weapon hand. He brought the flat of his gladius down hard on Scorus's knuckles. There was a sickening crack. The axe slipped from the man's numb fingers and fell to the sand. Scorus was now disarmed, half-blind, and hobbled. The fight should have been over, but the crowd, cheated of a brutal spectacle, began to boo. This wasn't the kind of victory they wanted. They wanted a slaughter. Kill him. Finish it. The sponsor of the games, a wealthy local magistrate named Falco, sat in a shaded box, looking bored and displeased. He wanted a show. Scorus, hearing the crowd, seemed to regain some of his feral rage. He lunged at Izuku, his bare hands outstretched like claws, trying to grapple him, to crush him with his bare strength. Izuku was too quick. He danced back, his sword held ready. The man was a wounded bear, still dangerous but clumsy. Izuku could see a dozen ways to end this. A thrust to the thigh to draw first blood, a cut across the chest. He could win, right here, right now. He drove Scorus back with a series of quick, precise feints. The big man, disoriented and in pain, tripped over his own feet and crashed heavily onto his back. He lay there, panting, defeated, his one good hand clutching his broken one. He looked up at Izuku, and for the first time, the rage in his eyes was replaced by something else, fear. Pure animal terror. Izuku stood over him, sword raised. The entire arena held its breath. The moment was his. All he had to do was strike. Draw blood. End the fight. The crowd was screaming for it. Their voices blended into a single, ugly word, Yugila. 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 Kill. 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 Izuku looked down at the pathetic, broken man at his feet. He saw not a monster, but a human being, condemned and terrified. Scorus wasn't a villain from a comic book. He was a man, and he was helpless. All of Izuku's instincts, his entire being, screamed in protest. He was a hero. Heroes don't execute helpless people for the entertainment of a mob. He couldn't do it. His arm trembled. He looked from the man on the sand to the magistrate, Falco, in the stands. He was supposed to look to the sponsor for the signal, thumbs up for mercy, thumbs down for death. But Izuku couldn't bring himself to ask for permission to kill or spare. The choice had to be his. He hesitated. A second stretched into an eternity. This was the ultimate test, not of his skill, but of his soul. Could he hold on to his core identity in this savage world? The magistrate, Falco, grew impatient with the delay. The crowd was getting ugly. This strange, non-violent spectacle was boring him. With a dismissive flick of his wrist, he gave the signal, thumbs down. A collective roar of approval went up from the crowd. Their bloodlust would be sated. 2 arena guards, armed with spears, stepped through one of the gates, ready to enforce the verdict if the boy faltered. Izuku saw the signal. He saw the guards approaching. His heart seized with panic. They were going to make him do it, or do it themselves. He looked back at Scorus. The man saw the thumbs down signal too. A choked, guttural sob escaped his lips. He knew his life was over. In a final, desperate, panic scramble, he tried to push himself up, to flee, to do something. His uninjured hand scrabbled in the sand and, by a cruel twist of fate, found the hilt of his discarded axe. What happened next was a chaotic, tragic accident. Scorus, in his blind panic, tried to heave himself to his feet using the axe as leverage. But his injured leg gave way. He slipped, his massive weight coming down, and the sharp, upturned blade of his own weapon pierced his side. It was a deep, mortal wound. A stunned silence fell over the arena. Scorus's eyes went wide, not with pain, but with a final, terminal surprise. A gout of dark blood pumped from the wound, staining the sand. He let out a final, shuddering gasp and then lay still. The silence was broken by a confused murmur from the crowd. Then, someone started to cheer. The victory was unconventional, accidental, but it was bloody. The man was dead, and in the end, that's all they really cared about. The cheers grew, a wave of relieved excitement. They had gotten their death, after all. Izuku stood frozen, staring at the body, his sword still raised. He hadn't killed him. But he was dead. He had won. The victory felt like ashes in his mouth. It was a fluke, a technicality born of his own hesitation. The announcer's voice, amplified by the arena's acoustics, boomed out. Winner by the will of the gods. Voridus, the name echoed around him. He felt disconnected from it, from the cheering crowd, from the body cooling on the sand. He had survived his first trial, but he felt hollowed out, shaken to his very core. He hadn't compromised his ideals, but a man was dead anyway. What did that make him? The guards escorted him from the arena, his shield and sword feeling like lead weights. As he was led back into the cool darkness of the tunnels, he passed Batiatus, who was waiting for him. His owner looked him up and down, his expression a mixture of annoyance and intrigue. A strange victory, Batiatus said, his voice a low rumble. You fought like a coward, but you won. The crowd is confused. They don't know whether to cheer you or curse you. You have made yourself interesting. Batiatus reached out and clapped a heavy hand on Izuku's shoulder. You have a new name now, boy. The crowd has given it to you. You are no longer just Voridus. You are Cuniculus the rabbit. Wear it with pride. A rabbit that can kill a wolf is a beast worth watching. Izuku didn't respond. He just stared into the darkness of the tunnel ahead. He had an aim. He had a victory. He had survived. But as he was led back to the Ludus, the image of Scorus's surprised, dying eyes was burned into his mind. He had won his first battle in the arena, but he felt terrifyingly certain that he had just taken his first step toward losing the war for his own soul. The green rabbit of the arena had been born, but the price of that birth felt impossibly high. The name clung to him like a second skin. Cuniculus. The rabbit. In the days following his first bloody victory, the name was on the lips of everyone in the Ludus. At first, it was a joke, a term of derision spat by the more traditional gladiators who saw his tactical, evasive style as a profound insult to their martial ethos. To them, glory was found in a clash of shields, in facing an opponent head-on with courage and strength. Izuku's victory, a technicality born of hesitation and a freak accident, was seen as a contemptible fluke. The rabbit won by luck, Neas, the hulking Murmillo, would grumble during training. The gods favored him. That luck will run out. But luck, as the gladiators of the Ludus Batiatus would soon learn, had very little to do with it. Batiatus, ever the pragmatist, saw a commodity in Izuku's strangeness. An unusual fighter was a memorable fighter, and a memorable fighter put spectators in the seats. He began scheduling Izuku for the Meridianum Spectaculum, the midday shows, which were often reserved for more novel or bizarre matchups. Izuku wasn't pitted against seasoned gladiators, but against other oddities, pairs of less skilled criminals, fighters with unconventional weapons, or in one terrifying instance, a captured Numidian hunter armed with a volley of short javelins. Each fight became a public lesson in applied tactical analysis. Each victory chipped away at the notion that he was merely lucky and began to build a new, perplexing legend. His second match was against two condemned pirates, armed with cutlasses and small bucklers. They were used to chaotic brawls on the decks of ships, not the focused combat of the arena. They rushed him together, expecting to overwhelm him with numbers. Instead of engaging, Izuku used his speed to separate them, forcing them to chase him. He led them on a grueling run around the perimeter of the arena until they were winded and their coordination began to fail. He saw one pirate glance at the other, a moment of nonverbal communication, a plan to flank him. Anticipating the move, Izuku abruptly changed direction, charging the pirate who had just given the signal. The man, caught off guard, was easily disarmed. With the odds evened, the second pirate lost his nerve and yielded, dropping his sword and begging for mercy. The crowd, though slightly disappointed by the lack of blood, murmured in appreciation of the cleverness. His third match, against the javelin-wielding hunter, was a masterclass in risk assessment. Izuku entered the arena and immediately sprinted not towards his opponent, but towards the body of a criminal who had been executed earlier in the show. He hefted the corpse, a gruesome and shocking act, and used it as a macabre shield. The hunter, unnerved, wasted his javelins on the dead man. Once the hunter was disarmed, he was no match for Izuku's swordsmanship and quickly surrendered. The crowd, initially horrified, erupted into a roar of stunned applause. It was ghoulish, unprecedented, and utterly brilliant. Izuku's reputation began to transform. He was still the rabbit, but now the name carried a different weight. It was less an insult and more a title. Rabbits were quick, clever, and notoriously difficult to catch. He never won with overwhelming force. His victories were not the stuff of epic poems, they were the stuff of intricate puzzles. Spectators began to come to the Capuan arena specifically to see him, placing bets not on whether he would win, but on how. He will use the shadow of the western wall to blind his opponent at the apex of the sun, one spectator might wager. No, he will feign injury to his left leg, drawing the attack, only to reveal it was a ruse, another would argue. His fights became a strange sort of intellectual exercise for the mob. They were watching a strategist at work, his mind the deadliest weapon in the arena. Batiatus, seeing the influx of coin, was delighted. He ordered better food for Izuku and moved him to a slightly larger cell, a clear mark of his rising value. Within the Ludus, the dynamics shifted profoundly. Contempt curdled into a grudging, wary respect. The other gladiators began to watch his training sessions with a new intensity. They saw that his constant muttering wasn't madness, but a form of intense concentration. They saw his endless analysis of their own fighting styles not as an odd tick, but as a genuine threat. One sweltering afternoon, Valerius was preparing for an important match, a Primus Paulus bout against a visiting champion from a rival Ludus. The champion was a Dimachorus, a master of two blades. Valerius, for all his power and pride, was struggling in his sparring sessions. His large shield and single sword were ill-suited to defending against the dizzying, multi-pronged attacks of a dual wielder. He grew increasingly frustrated, his roars of anger echoing across the yard. Izuku watched from the sidelines, his mind automatically breaking down the problem. He saw Valerius repeatedly overcommitting to blocking one sword, leaving himself open to the other. He saw the Dimachorus style was all about rhythm, a constant, alternating flurry that could be disrupted. After Valerius angrily threw his practice sword to the ground, Izuku hesitantly approached him. "You're trying to block the swords," Izuku said quietly, speaking the simple, functional Latin he had painstakingly learned. Valerius spun around, his face a mask of fury. What would a rabbit know of fighting a true warrior? He spat. Izuku didn't flinch. He had faced down far worse than the Gaul's temper. "You can't block both swords," he continued, his voice steady. "So don't block his body. Your shield is big enough. Forget his blades. Use your shield like a wall. Pin him. His swords are useless if he has no room to swing them." He then pointed to the sparring Dimachorus on the other side of the yard. "And watch his feet. He shifts his weight to his left foot before he begins his main assault. That is his tell. When you see the shift, charge before he can start his attack. Break his rhythm." Valerius stared at him, his initial anger giving way to a flicker of surprise. The boy's observations were unnervingly accurate. He had been so focused on the flashing blades that he hadn't considered the man wielding them. He grunted, a sound that was neither agreement nor dismissal, and turned away, picking up his sword. The next day, Valerius fought his match. The crowd roared for the flashy Dimachorus, but the Gaul was a different fighter. He was patient. He held his ground, his shield held tight to his body. He weathered the initial flurry, and then, just as Izuku had predicted, he saw the telltale shift in his opponent's footing. Valerius exploded forward. It was not a wild charge, but a focused, disciplined rush. He didn't swing his sword. He used his shield as a battering ram, slamming it into the Dimachorus, pinning him against the arena wall. The dual-wielder swords were trapped, useless. From that range, Valerius's short, powerful gladius was the superior weapon. The fight ended seconds later. When Valerius returned to the Ludus that evening, victorious, he walked past Izuku, who was cleaning his armor. The big Gaul paused. He didn't speak. He simply placed a small wineskin and a piece of roasted meat on the bench beside Izuku, then walked away. It was more than a peace offering. It was an acknowledgement. A silent, grudging partnership had been forged. The brute strength of the Ludus and its sharpest mind had found a measure of common ground. Izuku's conversations with Livia also deepened. She was his one true confidant, the only person in this brutal world who saw the boy behind the gladiator. She would tend to his minor wounds after training, her quiet presence a calming balm. He learned her story in whispered fragments. She was from a Thracian tribe conquered by the legions. Her village was burned, her family killed or enslaved. She had been sold and resold until she ended up in Batiatus's Ludus, her knowledge of herbs and healing her only asset. "Do you ever dream of seeing your home again?" Izuku asked her one evening, as she wrapped a fresh bandage around his hand. Livia's fingers stilled for a moment. A profound sadness clouded her dark eyes. "My home is Ash, Izuku," she said softly, using his real name, a secret intimacy they shared. "There is nothing to go back to. I dream only of freedom. A life where I am not owned. Where I can walk in a field and not have to ask permission." Her simple, powerful dream resonated deep within him. His own desire to return home felt impossibly grand and selfish by comparison. Livia didn't want to save the world, she just wanted to own her own life. Her dream gave his own fight a new, more immediate purpose. He wasn't just fighting for his own survival anymore. He was fighting for her, for the hope that one day, people like her could be free. He began to share some of the extra food and small coins he earned from his victories with her, a small gesture of solidarity that she accepted with a quiet, grateful nod. It was this growing, peculiar fame of the strategist of the sands that brought him to the attention of a far more dangerous class of spectator than the Capuan mob. Senator Gaius Licinius Crassus was a man carved from Roman ambition. He was tall, elegantly robed in the finest purple-striped toga, with a patrician's sharp features, intelligent, calculating eyes, and a mouth that seemed perpetually fixed in a slight, condescending smile. He was a power player in Rome, a master of political maneuvering whose influence was as vast as his cruelty was subtle. To Gaius Licinius, the games were not mere entertainment. They were a powerful political tool. They were a way to gauge the mood of the mob, to curry favor with the masses, to ruin rivals, and to display one's own power and wealth. He had come to Capua on business, and, hearing tales of Basiatus's thinking gladiator, decided to amuse himself with a visit to the local Ludus. His arrival was an event. The entire Ludus was assembled in the courtyard, standing in rigid formation as the senator and his retinue of lictors and slaves swept in. Basiatus, usually the undisputed master of his domain, was a model of fawning subservience, bowing and scraping before the man from Rome. Senator Licinius walked down the lines of gladiators, inspecting them as if they were prize horses. His cold, gray eyes scanned each man, assessing his build, his scars, his market value. He would occasionally stop, ask a man's origin, or order two of them to perform a brief, weaponless sparring match for his amusement. His gaze passed over Valerius with a flicker of appreciation for his raw power. It swept past the other veterans with a practiced, dismissive air. Then, his eyes landed on Izuku. He stopped. The entire courtyard seemed to hold its breath. The senator's smile widened slightly. So, he said, his voice smooth and cultured, a stark contrast to the guttural sounds of the Ludus. This is the famous Cuniculus. The rabbit. He is smaller than the stories suggest. He has the heart of a lion, noble senator, Basiatus supplied eagerly. And the mind of a philosopher. Licinius chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. He circled Izuku slowly, his gaze analytical, unnerving. Izuku felt like a specimen under a microscope. This man's gaze was far more terrifying than Valerius's glare or Scaurus's rage. Theirs was a simple, understandable threat. The senator's gaze was complex, layered, and utterly predatory. He wasn't looking at a fighter. He was looking at a chess piece. A mind, the senator mused, tapping a long, elegant finger against his chin. How droll. Strength, courage, brutality, these are the common virtues of the arena. They are cheap. But a mind? A gladiator who can think? Now that is a novelty. A novelty that could be useful. He turned to Basiatus. I am sponsoring a magnificent set of games in Rome next month, to celebrate the emperor's recent victories in Dacia. I require the finest gladiators to grace the sands of the Flavian amphitheater. Your champion, the Gaul, is impressive. A fine, straightforward brute. I will take him. Basiatus beamed, his chest puffing out with pride. I will also take your Thracian brothers, and your best Rediarius, the senator continued, gesturing dismissively at the gladiators in question, and then, his cold eyes settled back on Izuku. And I will take the rabbit. A stunned silence fell. Basiatus's smile faltered. Valerius was his champion, his pride. But Izuku, the strange, clever rabbit, was his cash cow, his unique attraction. Senator, with all due respect, Basiatus stammered. The boy he is a provincial favorite. He is not yet seasoned enough for the Colosseum. Licinius's smile vanished. His eyes turned to chips of ice. Are you refusing me, Basiatus? Are you suggesting that your judgment of gladiatorial talent surpasses my own? I assure you, your provincial favorite will be far more profitable for you in my service than he ever could be in this dusty little pit. The threat was unspoken but crystal clear. Basiatus paled, his bravado evaporating. He bowed low, his forehead nearly touching the ground. No, noble senator. Of course not. He is yours. They are all yours. It is an honor. I thought so, Licinius said, his pleasant demeanor returning as if it had never left. He tossed the heavy purse to Batiatus, a sum that was clearly far more than generous. It was not a payment, it was a statement of power. He was not buying gladiators, he was acquiring assets. He gave Izuku one last, lingering look. "Prepare yourself, rabbit," he said, his voice a low, conspiratorial whisper. "The games in Capua are a child's puppet show. In Rome, you will learn what true spectacle is. You will learn what true power is. And you will be a part of it." With that, the senator and his entourage swept out of the Ludus, leaving a stunned and silent courtyard in their wake. Izuku stood frozen, the senator's words echoing in his mind. Rome. The Colosseum. The name itself was a legend, a synonym for the grandest, most glorious, and most lethal spectacle in the entire world. He was being taken from the frying pan of Capua and thrown into the heart of the fire. He was no longer just a gladiator fighting for his survival. He was now a pawn, a possession of one of the most powerful and ruthless men in the Roman Empire. He had thought that by being clever, he could control his own destiny on the sand. But he now understood a terrifying new truth. The arena itself was just a stage. The real games, the ones of life and death, were played by men like Senator Licinius in the shadows, and gladiators were just the bloodied pieces they moved across the board. His fight for survival had just become infinitely more complex, and infinitely more dangerous.